Good evening, and welcome to the Forbes Center for the Performing Arts. Please take a moment to locate your nearest emergency exit, and at this time, please stop texting and turn off your cell phone. As mandated by federal copyright law, any form of unauthorized recording or photography is strictly prohibited. There will be no intermission. Thank you. We hope you enjoy the performance.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming to my lecture recital. I'm really excited to talk about the use of the horn in jazz to you for an hour. So, to start off, I'd like to pose the question up on the slide. How does a hornist learn jazz? Because even in the modern era, where we have developed, mature jazz programs in big schools, the horn really doesn't have a place there. There's no horn in big band. There's not an applied horn professor in jazz at most universities. It's just atypical for a horn player to learn jazz. So, as I learned it, I had to look to history for my inspiration. Early jazz bands, well, even modern jazz bands tend not to have horns in them. Almost all brass instruments appear in popular music. Trumpets and trombones naturally have their own sections in big bands. Even tuba and sousaphone sometimes appear in Dixieland bands, and yet the horn does not. So, horn is a classical instrument, pretty stereotypically. It's sometimes present in popular recordings. There's like a Beatles song with horn playing in it. There's a Rolling Stones song with a horn solo, but overall there isn't a strong presence in popular music like there is in classical and like other brass instruments have achieved in popular music. That said, some early jazz bands did experiment with using horns as part of their regular instrumentation. Among them were Claude Thornhill's band, which had two horn parts. One of the horn players I'm going to talk about tonight, John Gross, played in that band for a year. Stan Kenton's band had 2 to 3 horns in the section, and it included some one-off solos as well. Vince DeRosa, horn players, if you know 20th century horn playing, you should know the name Vince DeRosa, played with Stan Kenton. Although Kenton eventually returned to the standard 10-piece brass, that is 5 trumpets and 5 trombones. The Lionel Hampton Band, which I will come back to later, also hired 2 of the horn players I'm going to talk about tonight, Willie Ruff and David Amram. Now let's talk a little bit about the writing for horn in these bands. So, one-off songs would include horn solos that, by and large, work as horn solos, where the horn is doing its own thing. However, when the instrument was a regular part of the band's orchestration, or when there was a section of instruments, the parts tended to fade into the background. The instrument really did not have a strong place, and it almost functioned more as a 5th trombone than as a section in its own right. Which is to say that the playing was in the background and used for harmonic support, and mostly in unison, well, in rhythmic unison with the trombone lines. This is a recording of one of Miles Davis's albums, Miles Ahead, with Willie Ruff, one of the players I'm going to talk about tonight, playing horn. I want you to listen for an alto register descending chromatic line. It's almost buried in the texture, so you may have to listen closely. Did anyone hear it? Yeah. And so you might say, well, this is a Miles Davis album. We shouldn't expect any instrument other than trumpet to be featured prominently. However, there was also a saxophone solo in there. These preludes at any rate, did include instruments as solos that were not trumpet. And yet, I'm unaware of any horn recording, at least with this band, where that happened. So, let's move on to the case studies. Early jazz hornists tended to combine a strong classical background and technical background on the instrument with on-the-job jazz learning. They tended to take opportunities as they came. They often, not always, but often had childhood jazz experience, although they had little in the way of formal jazz training. We're going to look tonight at 4 jazz hornists, between them active from roughly 1940 to 1970. John Gross, Willie Ruff, Julius Watkins, and David Amram. John Gross was the earliest of these hornists. He was born in 1917 and died in 1962. He was actually in a touring concert band after high school, and he studied with Max Poddick, the second horn in the Chicago Symphony at the time. In 1940, Gross received a scholarship to study at Tanglewood with William Vulcanier, the principal horn of the Boston Symphony. In the following year, 1941, he turned down a scholarship at Juilliard in favor of a job with the Indianapolis Symphony. He was appointed principal in Indianapolis in 1941, although he left a year later in 1942 to play with Claude Thornhill's band. In 1942, he was also drafted into the Army, as many men were at the time. This is a picture of Gross in the Army band, and he was discharged in 1945. Following this, he was active in New York for about 2 years. He mostly did classical work, freelancing, although he did study jazz with the jazz pianist Lenny Tristano. In 1947, so after 2 years of classical freelancing, Gross joined Tex Benecchi's big band, where he was frustrated with a lack of solo opportunities. So he left in 1949 to play with Stan Kenton's Innovations in Modern Music Orchestra. He played with Kenton until 1953, and he was featured on a track named after him. This is a short recording, or an excerpt from the track John Gross. Jazz bands had string sections in them. So, after working with Kenton, in the early 50s, Gross moved west to play in film orchestras. He collaborated with a lot of big-name musicians out in Los Angeles, among them Liberace, who described him as the greatest horn player in the world. And Gross also began to record his own compositions. He became involved also in the third stream, which was a sort of jazz classical fusion movement that's outside the scope of this lecture. But following that, he died in 1962 at age 45. He was a notable player, but he actually left relatively little impact on the field of horn playing. The next player we're going to talk about is Willie Ruff, who was born in 1931 and died in 2023. In his childhood, he learned piano and drums informally to play in his church band. At age 14, in 1946, he joined the Army band. He wanted to play drums originally, but he switched to horn to shore up a weak section. He also studied with Abe Kniaz, who was the principal horn in the Columbus Symphony at the time. Ruff was stationed in Ohio. In the Army band, he also started playing bass on the side, and he met Dwight Mitchell, who later became Ruff's lifetime collaborator in the Mitchell-Ruff duo. This is a picture of Ruff in the Army. As you can see, it was a different time because that is visibly not a grown man. This is a picture of the 766 Air Corps Band. This is Willie Ruff and Dwight Mitchell. Sergeant Arthur Baskerville was a trombone player in the band to whom Ruff was close, but I took this picture from somewhere interviewing Ruff. Baskerville's not relevant to what I'm talking about right now. You might also notice that the 766 Air Corps is also the unit to which of which the famous Tuskegee Airmen were a part. After the Army, which he left in 1949, Ruff studied at Yale. he went to Yale because his teacher Abe Kniaz recommended learning from Paul Hindemith, and he also saw an interview with Charlie Parker, the bebop player, saying that Parker wanted to study with Hindemith as well. Ruff got a bachelor's degree from Yale in 1953 and completed a master's in 1954. However, here he ran into a bit of a problem in that it was 1954 and Ruff was black. So black musicians at the time were largely unwelcome in American symphony orchestras. So Ruff decided to go international. He actually won a position in an orchestra in Tel Aviv. And then, before he was set to go, he was watching the Ed Sullivan show, where he happened to see his friend Dwight Mitchell. So he called Mitchell, reconnected, and through Mitchell got an invitation to play with Lionel Hampton's band. So he backed out of the Tel Aviv opportunity and started playing on tour with the Hampton band. On the tour, Mitchell and Ruff established a duo and began to work on original music in their free time. Ruff stayed in Hampton's band for less than a year. The pay was very low and changed with location. He started playing in the band at the Apollo Theater in New York, where he was paid very well, union scale in New York. However, the second they started to go on tour, all the union protections vanished. He started to be paid only for the days that he actually performed and not the days that he rehearsed or traveled. And Hampton's wife, who managed the band, learned about Mitchell and Ruff playing music on the side and fired them. This actually turned out to be relatively fortunate for the duo because on the 1st of October in 1955, days after they were fired, the band was actually in a bus wreck that injured 16 players. It was also good for them because they started the Mitchell-Ruff duo and they kind of had to be successful because this was their job. The Mitchell-Ruff duo was a lifetime collaboration that really took off when they were fired. So they moved back to New York where they started playing clubs where they were hired as an intermission band. This was around mid-1955. They were hired as rough states because the bookers realized that it was very cheap to hire 2 musicians. Although this was also very important in their career in that it put them in contact with a lot of very famous jazz players. They had a regular job at the Café Bohemia, which Ruff described as his baptism into the world of thoroughly modern jazz. And they also had regular work at Birdland, playing between Count Basie sets. And Birdland at the time was the Carnegie Hall of jazz. I've seen that in Pat Smith's dissertation. It was a very important location. This is a picture of the Mitchell-Ruff duo from an album from the 80s, but you can see this is Ruff on the bass, Mitchell on the keys, and if you don't recognize him by the cheeks, you should recognize him by the bent trumpet. This is Dizzy Gillespie. The Mitchell-Ruff duo, as a lifetime collaboration, continued until Mitchell died in 2013. Although, when they were starting out, they did a lot of educational concerts, including for a group called Young Audiences, started in 1956. They were also on the forefront of a lot of American music. They were the first jazz group to tour the Soviet Union. That happened in 1959. They also started touring and gave educational concerts in China in 1981. And Willie Ruff, throughout the course of his life, was very involved in jazz education. He did these Young Audiences concerts. He and Mitchell also did a series of college educational concerts, which are pretty much exactly what they sound like. They would show up, play some jazz on stage, and talk about the significance of jazz as an American musical art form and its history. Ruff was also on the faculty at UCLA beginning in 1968, where he taught an Afro-American music course. But independent of the duo, Ruff owned the Playback Club in New Haven, Connecticut through the 1960s. Incidentally, this was the venue where Aretha Franklin made her professional debut. And he joined the Yale faculty in 1971. It's kind of difficult to figure out exactly what he taught. Fortunately, Professor Zook was able to get in contact with Katie Ambrose, the new horn player at Indiana, who was a very helpful source. She says he taught orchestration and arranging, but also seminars on his research, which primarily consisted of jazz and other Black American musical traditions. I also managed to find some student anecdotes on Jazzphora Online saying that he taught a history of jazz class in his first year there, which lines up with his demonstrated research interests. In 1972, in his second year at Yale, Ruff established the Duke Ellington Fellowship Program. His duties aside from teaching consisted largely of running that and a corresponding initiative for music in the school system until the Yale School of Music took that program over around 2008. This brings me to the first piece I'm going to play tonight, Billy Strayhorn's Suite for the Duo. Strayhorn wrote this piece several months before his death in 1967. It was probably one of the, and he wrote it very close to the end of life. It was naturally one of the last things that he wrote. He came to a Mitchell-Ruff duo gig unprompted and asked Ruff to read a draft of something Strayhorn had written for Ruff and the French horn. During this reading session, Duke Ellington called Strayhorn, and Strayhorn had Ruff play the part over the phone to Ellington. Strayhorn then took the part, erased parts of it, and rewrote parts of it in accordance with Ellington's live feedback and had Ruff play it again. And so they did this for several days, and finally they wound up with a finished horn part, at which point they invited Dwight Mitchell in to do the exact same thing with the piano part, after the horn part had been finalized. So the piece is something of an experiment in horn writing. It's the only thing that Billy Strayhorn ever wrote for horn and piano. This presents a little bit of a problem because the only available score is a transcription. I was not able to find anything from Billy Strayhorn's own hand. And large parts of it are obviously improvised in the Mitchell-Ruff duo reference recording I used. In particular, two extended piano movements extended piano introductions for two of the movements. It being improvised, my pianist Taylor and I reworked a few parts to make it sound better and integrate better with our particular ensemble. As you will hear, the writing experimental is very, the horn does something and then the piano does something, or the horn and piano are doing almost unrelated things at the same time. And Strayhorn explored a different style in each movement. So the first movement is full of ripping horn calls that reference the instrument's history as a signal. The second movement is almost a vocalese in a blues style. The horn plays a song-like blues line. The third movement is a march experimenting with very modern harmonies for its time. I like to call it Strayhorn meets Paul Hindemith. And the fourth movement is almost free jazz in Mitchell and Ruff's recording. Taylor and I made a couple of stylistic choices based on Strayhorn's markings, but we had to rework large swaths of the fourth movement. This is Strayhorn and Ruff on the album, this is not Strayhorn and Ruff, this is Mitchell and Ruff on their album Strayhorn and Mitchell-Ruff Interpretation. And without further ado, Taylor and I are going to play the Suite for the Duo. Something not so completely different. The next horn player we're going to talk about tonight is Julius Watkins. He was born in 1921 and died in 1977. Julius Watkins was really the first significant horn soloist in jazz. His first record as a band leader was in 1954. He was basically active until he died. His list of discography is like as long as my arm. I could spend the entire lecture recital just listing it out, but I won't. He also worked with a lot of jazz legends, first among them Thelonious Monk, but also Charles Mingus and others. He pushed technical boundaries on the instrument. He had just truly insane technical ability, including ridiculous high range. He also blended extraordinarily well, and he had the virtuosity to match a saxophone's speed. Julius Watkins started playing horn at age 9, and he studied in high school with Francis Hallstein of the Detroit Symphony. He was born and raised in Detroit. He ran into the same problem that Willie Ruff did about 20 years later, in that black players were not accepted in American symphony orchestras in the 30s. So, frustrated with the lack of solo classical horn repertoire, he decided to play jazz instead. He joined a community band in Detroit where he sight-transposed parts written for other instruments. In 1939, Watkins actually started playing trumpet in Ernie Field's band. This was a touring band. He was a little frustrated with the touring life, and he channeled those frustrations into all-night practice sessions, which he described as like dissociative in a way. He left that band in 1942. I'm surprised he stuck out the 3 years. After leaving Fields, Watkins moved to Denver to play in a dance band, and though the band was successful, the group was too casual for Watkins. The other members of the band would get distracted by like their girlfriends or like drinking and going out and having fun. So the group disbanded a year later, and Watkins moved back to Detroit in 1943. Watkins did various work for about 3 years, including about a 3-month stint in the Navy Reserve. But in 1946, he joined Milt Buckner's big band, this time playing horn. This was Watkins' big break, although he still wasn't really happy with his role. He described the horn as it seeming too alone, as though it weren't integrated properly. So, in 1950, he left Detroit to attend the Manhattan School of Music. At the time, the Manhattan School of Music was favored by professional musicians because there you could skip classes to play a gig and they wouldn't punish you for it, but at Juilliard, you could not. Although this was still classical study. MSM did not open up its first jazz program until 1984, and even then it was a master's program and not a bachelor's degree. Watkins studied as a non-degree student, although he took the same courses as the music majors, and he left MSM in '53, at which point he joined Pete Rugelow's band and started to record with Thelonious Monk. And he was also highly respected by the other prominent New York freelancers. Ray Alonge, who at the time was the white freelancer who was everybody's first call, said that Watkins could play a full octave above his highest note. For the horn players in the room, the standard was that horn players could play up to a written C6, what we call high C. Watkins could play the C above that. So, for the non-horn players, not the stratosphere, but like geostationary orbit, that high. So, this is a recording of Watkins and his later partner in Les Jazz Modes, Charlie Rouse, the saxophone player. That is legitimately some of the best brass playing I have ever heard. The blend is just amazing. He was in tune, perfectly in tune on every note. I mean, that was amazing. So, Watkins met Rouse, the saxophone player from that recording, in 1955, and together they founded a band called Les Jazz Modes. This group was very successful. It played a week at Birdland in '57, and despite its success, in 1959, it broke up after a disastrous performance with an African dance group. The idea behind that gig was pretty sound. The logic was that jazz is a Black American dance tradition with a lot of elements coming from African traditions. So, what group better to perform with than an actual African dance group? I think they were Ghanaian, but I might be misremembering the reading. However, what seemed solid in concept was actually terrible in practice. The critics said that the band was very good and that the dancers were very good, independently. But together, they were doing things that had just no relation to each other whatsoever. And again, it was so bad that the band had to break up. However, after Les Jazz Modes, Julius Watkins actually had a pretty fruitful freelance period in which he collaborated a lot with big name jazz players. In particular, he went on Quincy Jones' Free and Easy tour, in which the band became stranded in France with very little pay. This was during the Algerian crisis in France, and apparently the producer literally called Jones and was like, "You guys need to be on a plane to New York on Saturday, or you can stay in France, but I don't have any work lined up for you after that." And so the band voted to stay in France. When I say little pay, I mean sometimes they were not paid in money, they were paid in drugs. Yeah. During this tour, though, Watkins made a lot of personal connections that later led to some professional success. He got the nickname The Phantom, which is for a number of reasons. Tom Varner, one of his later students, said that people always thought it was because of his sound, like he could come in with this mysterious soft high note. Others said it was because he wouldn't show up to gigs. Other times, you're sitting around and talking, and you look around, and he was gone. It was like, where did Julie's go? It was a nickname with numerous connections. I've also heard that he got the nickname because he would warm up really, really quietly backstage. In any event, the Free and Easy Tour established Watkins as the premier artist of the jazz horn in the world. That's a quote from Pat Smith's doctoral dissertation on Julius Watkins. This is a recording of Watkins soloing while on tour with Quincy Jones, although this was not when they were stranded in France. I believe this is from Vienna. So, following the tour, Watkins did extensive freelancing both in classical and jazz over the course of the 60s. However, as time passed, chronic health conditions began to interfere with his playing. He had dental problems, he had liver and kidney issues, he had diabetes, and he was a heavy drinker, a habit which he picked up in France on that tour. And because of that, his creative output dropped almost to nothing in 1968. In fact, he lost his home and studio, and he had to live with his friend, the drummer Warren Smith, for over a year. However, he started playing again in 1969, and he eventually taught jazz horn privately from 1972 onwards. And his students included the current jazz hornists Tom Varner and Vincent Chansey. Watkins died in 1977 at age 55. The next player we're going to talk about is David Amram. Born in 1930, and he's still alive. In fact, he was a featured artist at last year's International Horn Symposium right here. So, Amram is a multi-instrumentalist and a composer, although his primary instrument is horn. And he has worked in basically every genre of music, and some genres that aren't music. So, this quote is from the foreword of his autobiography. In the 1990s, when the term multiculturalism became an official watchword for the arts, I was suddenly considered a pioneer. His point being that he had always done exactly what he wanted to that seemed fun at the moment, and then suddenly tastes changed and he was a trendsetter. So, along that line, Amram worked with basically everyone. I'm going to present you an abridged list, and I want you to see how many names you recognize. In the classical world, he worked with Leonard Bernstein and Aaron Copland, amongst others. In the jazz world, Thelonious Monk, Dizzy Gillespie, Charles Mingus, Sonny Rollins, Lionel Hampton, Kenny Dorham, Arturo Sandoval, and Wynton Marsalis. In the folk and country world, Bob Dylan, Arlo Guthrie, and Willie Nelson. He also did not limit himself to working in music. In literature, he collaborated with Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac. This picture is of David Amram, right here, with titans of American literature of the 20th century. This is Jack Kerouac. Can you see the cursor? No. Okay. Well, David Amram is the guy in the sweater making the face. Jack Kerouac is the guy to his left in the image. Allen Ginsberg is on the same side of the table as Amram. Gregory Corso here has his back to the camera, and Larry Rivers is the one with the slicked back hair. He was moving in Amram was moving in influential circles. So, his early years. Amram had a strong musical influence in his childhood, where his father introduced him to classical music and his uncle introduced him to jazz. He learned piano from age 7, but he eventually settled on horn as his main instrument, although he did make his professional debut playing trumpet in Louise Brown's band at age 12 for $1 a night and all the ice cream he could eat in the bar. He studied at Oberlin for a year, but he eventually transferred to George Washington University as, of all things, a history major. He also took lessons while he was at George Washington from Abe Kniaz, who was the principal at the time in the National Symphony Orchestra after having been in the Columbus Symphony, but that group collapsed. Kniaz, as you may remember, taught Willie Ruff earlier. And because this will be important later, around this time, Willie Ruff was in the middle of a bachelor's degree at Yale. So, Amram's early career included serving in an army band in Europe from 1952 to 1954. He lived in Paris after his discharge, and he toured Europe for the State Department. In Paris, he committed himself to writing music, and he also recorded with Lionel Hampton's band. This would have been the first half of 1955. The second half of 1955, he returned to New York to study at the Manhattan School of Music, where he learned horn from Gunther Schuller, the noted jazz composer and hornist. Interestingly, Willie Ruff played with Lionel Hampton's band for a little while, and he left. He was gone by the 1st of October, because remember, the bus crash. So, Willie Ruff's autobiography makes reference to Hampton mentioning that he never had a French horn in the band before. So as best I can tell, this means that Amram's session with Hampton did not constitute his being a member of the band. It was a one-off recording session. This is a picture of Amram with Lionel Hampton's band in Paris. Amram is naturally the guy holding the horn. So, while studying at the Manhattan School of Music, Amram had insane freelance success. He played with Mingus at the Café Bohemia. He played with Oscar Pettiford at Birdland. And later, he formed his own jazz group to play at the Five Spot Cafe. Again, these are just enormous places in jazz, and he was doing it as he put himself through school. Interestingly, he was also active in New York at the same time as Willie Ruff. And neither of their autobiographies mentions the other. Seriously, I command F'd the entire text of the books for, like, in each case. You know, Willie Ruff in David Amram's autobiography and David Amram in Willie Ruff's, nothing. They do not talk about each other at all. I have no idea why this is. They studied with the same teacher, Abe Kniaz. They both played in Lionel Hampton's band in the same calendar year. They both started freelancing in New York about mid-1955. They both played the same odd instrument for jazz. They both played the same clubs with the same people. In particular, Café Bohemia with Charles Mingus, where David Amram, one, played a lot, and two, liked to just hang around, and where Willie Ruff and the Mitchell-Ruff duo had a regular gig. And again, they don't mention each other. They had to have known about each other. I have no idea why this is. I speculate that this might have something to do with racial lines. Amram is white, Ruff was black. Segregation was a very, very strong social force at the time. But this is just really, really interesting, and I cannot explain it. So, Amram's later career, by which I mean his life after the age of 25. He did a lot of things. I'm going to give you some of the highlights and the parts I thought were the most interesting. He was the New York Philharmonic's first composer in residence at the invitation of Leonard Bernstein in 1966. He was the composer for the film The Manchurian Candidate, amongst many other movies. He wrote incidental music for 25 Shakespeare productions. He did government-sponsored tours in Brazil, Kenya, Cuba, and the Middle East. This was during the embargo, by the way, so he was one of the first Americans to visit Cuba legally for like 17 years. And he had a long-standing friendship with Thelonious Monk, which brings me to the next piece I'm going to play, Blues and Variations from Monk. This piece was written in memory of Thelonious Monk after the composer died, and it draws heavily from the chromatic lines in one of Monk's most famous works, Blue Monk. The notation also imitates Monk's rhythmic style, which includes a mix of straight and swung eighth notes. And Amram's own program notes describe it as the best series of 12-bar choruses Amram never played but wished he had. This is Blue Monk, and I'm just going to play you the head of the tune so you can hear so you can hear Thelonious Monk mixing straight and swung eighth notes. Here is some of Amram's notation from Blues and Variations from Monk. As you can see, there are eighth notes, which I would be inclined, given the style of the piece, to read as swung. However, there are swung parts clearly notated in triplets. So, the recordings I've listened to, and I, try to realize the notation exactly as is rhythmically written. This is David Amram playing with Dizzy Gillespie and Percy Heath at the Thelonious Monk tribute concert in 1986. So now, Blues and Variations from Monk. having discussed the four horn players I wanted to discuss, let's talk about my journey learning jazz. I have been listening to jazz for a long time, and I even have some experience playing. So, I played for 3 years, playing trumpet in my high school's jazz band. I did a few one-offs on horn in jazz band when UNCSA's jazz band, that is my undergrad, needed one. Although the bigger push for me to learn jazz came from me being a pretty serious swing dancer. I've been dancing for 5 years, largely Lindy Hop, which is danced primarily to big band swing music from between the 20s to the 50s-ish, or music written in that style. There's a lot of modern bands putting out stuff. I'm basically familiar with the history of swing dance, which co-evolved with swing music. And my first public improvised solo on horn was actually at a dance event. It was last December. This is a picture of me dancing at that event, Lindy Focus. I'm not going to play you the recording of my very first improvised solo on horn. This is from actually about a month ago at Lindy Fest in Texas. So I'm a pretty serious dancer, and that's why I want to learn jazz. Which brings me to my actual study. In the footsteps of the horn players I've talked about, I just dove in. So I took an independent study with Dr. Connell. I actually took Dr. Connell's improvisation in world music seminar last semester, and that was a lot of fun. But this semester I took an independent study in which we discussed specifically jazz improvisation. So I worked on soloing over changes, and I transcribed and analyzed solos from various recordings. Jazz soloing has different priorities from what I expected. I came in thinking a lot about melody and line, and it actually is rhythm and arpeggio that are the driving forces in solos, or at least they're what Dr. Connell told me to think about more. My classical training prioritizes the root and fifth of chords, the structural elements that define a chord's harmonic function, whereas jazz solos tend to land on the third or seventh. These are not structural elements of a chord, but they do give a chord its characteristic quality and unique sound. Incidentally, the jazz idea of rootless voicings, which as a concept makes very little sense in a traditional classical structure, makes more sense to me now when I realize what the actual important elements of a chord are. I also learned a lot from learning by ear. It's a different framework. Transcribing solos and learning by ear shows you that music really only exists when it's played. Reading even the best score is not the same as hearing a performance because notation only captures a very small part of what actually goes on in music. This is a difficult conceptual bridge to cross, but classical training emphasizes a lot of musical analysis on the page, without necessarily making reference to a recording. I cannot imagine doing what I did in jazz this semester without listening to recordings. Classical training in many respects emphasizes learning by executing rules, whereas my jazz study instead emphasized learning by imitation and doing. So, to show you what I learned, Taylor and I are going to play 3 jazz standards for you today. Take the A Train by Duke Ellington and Billy Strayhorn, Misty by Errol Garner, and It Don't Mean a Thing, again by Duke Ellington. But before we do this, I would like to acknowledge a few people without whose help this recital simply could not have happened. So, my immense thanks go out, naturally, to Professor Ian Zook, my advisor, Dr. Andrew Connell, who taught me so much about jazz, Taylor Treese, my wonderful pianist, and the Forbes staff for maintaining and streaming and doing everything in this amazing concert space that we as JMU students get to play in. Thank you very much, everybody. And this is just a jazz band that I found that has all sorts of instruments. Look, there's a sousaphone, there's a banjo, I think these are some clarinets. Anyway, as I play an odd jazz instrument, I wanted to put up some odd jazz instruments while Taylor and I play the standards.
Thank you.